En zal even hier testen. Yeah, we are live on YouTube, I see. I just need to refresh my LinkedIn feed, because there we will start seeing a lot of people join. And just checking it, I believe. Yeah. All right. So we are live. We already have like more than almost three dozen people on LinkedIn. So hey guys, this is me, Terry, and I have with me today Fons van Sommeren. I'll give a very brief introduction, and I will let Fons to give you a detailed introduction about who he is, what does he do at the University of Eindhoven, and specifically around his interest, actually his motivation on driving the innovation within healthcare through the use of artificial intelligence. I can give you a bit of a background. So I had seen Fons. So how did I get in touch with Fons? I got in touch with Fons, I think, I don't know, a few months ago. I saw Fons posting something about his dad. Fons, you had lost your dad, I believe, to cancer. That reminded me of the time when I was working for a consulting company in Utrecht in 2010, or actually October 2009 timeframe, and I got a call from my from home in India. My niece, she called me that Grandpa just fell on his face and he kind of is not able to get up in the bathroom. And I remember I was in Sweden, I think, giving a lecture to in the university on cloud computing, which was a big trend back then. I actually packed up my bags, flew as soon as possible to India. But within 3 months, I mean, my dad was gone. I mean, it was very sort of, to me, it was a gut-wrenching experience. Losing your first parent was an experience of very confrontational. And cancer, obviously, he had metastasis phase, stage 3 in his liver. And to me, the worst actually experience, so I had to mentally prepare myself and help my mom and my sisters to be the guy, to manage all these tasks. But what was worse was that the diagnosis, trying to understand, because I'm not a biologist or I'm not an oncologist, but trying to understand this whole ecosystem, I was just lost in it. I mean, we went doing second opinions. Fast forward, 10 years today, there is some control in terms of understanding. We are gaining more understanding about the diseases around ourselves. Technology is helping us with simple tools. Some tools are useful, reliable. Other tools are still in development to get some kind of a prognosis and also diagnosis on your condition. So I reached out to Fons, and then I said, hey, I sort of went through this a decade ago, and I know how you feel. So that was a connection. But since then, I started talking to Fons, and I said, okay, so how, so what are you doing actually? Which he's going to explain to you in wonderful and beautiful detail. So obviously that never left me. And for me, sort of, expanding my own exploration in healthcare has led for us to sort of launch our own startup, healthcare startup called CADe. And we are constantly sort of looking for ways to collaborate with universities and academic institutions. You may or may not know, I am also co-founder of the AI for Health focus group and World Health Organization. We're constantly working with WHO. We released a paper actually just a couple of 2 weeks ago on helping actually researchers and academics and also reviewers to understand the implications of how to understand and review research from medical practitioners in the field of AI. So all these things are going on, and I think the field is open for all of us. And without much ado, I want to kind of quickly shift to Fons. Fons, welcome. I'm super excited to have you. Finally, we can have a conversation together. and let the world. And we already have someone from Leiden. I don't know who that is, but hi from Leiden. And I'll keep sharing with you guys while Fons takes over the stage. So welcome, Fons. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, thank you. So do you want me to put up the slides already? Or
no, let's hear. Yeah. If you have the introduction baked in your slides, please go ahead.
Yeah, I can do it like this. It's no problem. So yes, my name is Fons van der Sommen. I'm an assistant professor at Eindhoven University of Technology, working on more or less automated image analysis, a branch of AI for healthcare applications. So basically, my mission is to make the lives of the medical doctors a bit easier by helping them better interpret all the information that's contained in medical imagery, leading to, in the end, a better patient care and hopefully happier patients and earlier diagnosis. So I have a small cluster of PhD students working under my supervision on a variety of topics with this same technology. This is actually that I have on my slide, so I will further introduce that on my slides. Hi to everybody, thanks for joining. So could you open the slides, or can I actually do that now?
Let me just share it. Let me just share it. There you go.
Yes, okay, great. So I still, is everybody able to see this now?
Yes, I think we can see. We all can see. I can see here also on our feed.
Okay, great. So I've made this mostly focused around the application which I've worked on most. Like you said, Terry, I've been working on this for quite a while now. Early detection of esophageal cancer using AI, and I will show you why this is really a great application to improve healthcare. So the outline of my talk, I will first introduce a bit of our group and what we are actually working on. Then the application for Barrett cancer detection, which is a specific type of esophageal cancer. And then finally, I will close with an outlook, depending a bit on how much time we have and how much time I have as well. So this is our nice building. It's a flux building of Eindhoven University of Technology. It's the department where I am in the electrical engineering department. And our office is actually directly below these rooftop terrace. So this is, maybe I can even use my pointer here. My desk is actually here, so it's a pretty nice location to especially in the summer months, given that there's no corona, of course, because now we're all working from home. So the VCA Research Group, that's the group that I'm part of. It's head by Professor Peter de Wit. He's the PI of the group. And it basically has a background in image and video compression, because like 15 to 20 years ago, if you want to compress your signal even better, then you could use image analysis technologies, because if you can predict the next frame, you only need to do that at both the encoder and decoder size, and you have to just transmit the error. And if you do it very well, if you can just predict almost perfectly the next video frame, then you only need to send a very small error. So that introduced image analysis in the group, and now we're basically only working on image analysis, and there's not much compression anymore. So the group, it's basically computer vision research with a strong affinity towards applications. So we're also working on how to actually get these applications embedded, how to make them work real time, and given all the constraints of the setting that you work in. So there are three application domains. We are working on self-driving cars, on surveillance, and on healthcare applications. And the healthcare cluster is the cluster that I'm heading within the VCA Research Group. So here you can see all my talented researchers. Basically, what we do is we use computer vision and AI for medical imaging, focusing on imaging and video processing, computer-aided detection and diagnosis, but also image quality assessment and denoising. So we have a project. We have a lot of projects with companies as well, and one is with Philips, for instance, a very nice project called the Nexus project, where we work on next-generation X-ray imaging, which aims at detecting bleeding in the brain, but with a new sensor. And this sensor is pretty noisy, and it turns out that you can also use AI to better denoise images in a particular fashion. So that's also things that we do. So some of the research themes that we're working on are neural network architectures. So you're all familiar with the UNet and ResNet architectures, EfficientNet. So we're actually also trying to improve those given a certain application. We're working towards unsupervised learning, because in the end, I think most data is unlabeled, like the vast majority of the data is unlabeled. If you can learn from this, then you can learn much more than if you only are restricted to your labeled samples. And I have a strong background in signal processing. I'm actually also part of the group of signal processing, and you can actually use tools. So you know that convolutional neural networks are really big now. The convolution is an operation that we use a lot in signal processing, and there are smart ways to decompose your signal using certain theoretical approaches, like, for instance, wavelet decomposition. And they turn out to be very effective if you combine that with deep learning. So some of the trends in medical imaging in particular, you see that the patient population is growing rapidly. There's better access to healthcare in a lot of countries. There's a lot of sensor development. So you see these sensors becoming increasingly complex, so giving more and more information to the medical doctor. So you see growing amount of data. So we have more patients and more information per patient, which leads to exploding amounts of data. So for the analysis of this, basically we need AI to make this comprehensive for the medical doctors, because it's just too much to just process by yourself with your human brain and human eyes. Some of the challenges that we identify and that are especially for medical imaging in the field is that the data is typically hard to acquire, especially in large quantities. You need labels if you want to do supervised learning. And labeling is typically a problem in medical domain, because it requires medical experts. I mean, cats and dogs we can label ourselves, but I mean, where exactly a cancerous lesion is something else. Then you notice that there is a considerable amount of inter-observer variability. Also, if you ask medical doctors to tell you in an image where is exactly a cancerous lesion, they can give completely different answers. And then you see that the edges are not that clearly defined. So you need to take into account this uncertainty. Then often these networks are very heavy that we use and very slow. So you want to make them efficient, that they can approach real time on medical devices. Also, you need to guarantee that it's stable for all possible inputs. So the main problem in my eyes with the current deep learning approaches is that the only way to really test them is only based on data. So the only way you say, okay, this model really works, is that you have some data set and you show, okay, for this data set, I get a really high score. But that's only for that data set, of course, and it's hard to guarantee stability for all possible input. And there are also some papers that painfully exposed some of the weaknesses of neural networks, where they try to make images that to fool the neural network. So probably you are aware of these things called adversarial attacks. That's very unnerving if you think about a medical application, that you get a completely wrong output only if a couple of pixels can change. So I think robustness is really important. Then a theme that's becoming more and more, getting more and more attention is interpretability, but also explainability. So interpretability referring to what's happening inside these networks. Explainability is how can we actually communicate this with humans, and I think that's also very essential in a clinical setting. In our group, we try to use this image processing background to improve convolutional neural networks, especially for the medical domain, and in the end to reduce costs, improve detection rate, and for instance lower radiation dose. If you can denoise an image very well, then you need less harmful radiation to make a clear image. And some of the topics that we work on is uncertainty, robustness, and explainability, like I just mentioned in the previous slides. And we always like to see if we can find a bridge to other computer vision domains. So we had a recent paper on a very efficient decoder for skin lesion detection, and then we thought we can maybe also use this for monocular depth estimation. So we tested and it worked quite well, and also for the automotive applications, we saw that you can significantly reduce the complexity of your decoder. So if there's a bridge to another domain, we always like to see if that also works, but mainly focusing on the medical domain. So then the clinical background of esophageal cancer, and in particular Barrett's cancer, that I've worked on quite a while, and I think it's a very nice application to show you, because we really got from the start to the clinical testing. First of all, some stats on cancer. So here you see the 5-year survival rate by stage. So if it's localized, most cancers have a pretty okay survival rate, but you see that the survival rate decreases as soon as you come into the more later stages of the disease, and especially for cancers that are in the GI, they are also detected very late. So you can see here. So for instance, for stomach cancer, esophageal cancer, colorectal cancer, they are a really the perfect storm for cancer, so to say, because the survival rate in a late phase of disease is very low, and also the stage of diagnosis is typically very late, right? So that's why these cancers are particularly lethal, because they just find it in a late stage of the disease. So that's why for most GI cancers, there are some screening programs in place. For instance, we have a colorectal screening program in the Netherlands, also a esophageal screening program. And for stomach, for instance, this stomach cancer is more a problem in Eastern countries like Japan. They have a screening program for stomach cancer. So they receive endoscopic procedures, which is typically less harmful than later when the typical diagnosis happens for the patients at the late phase. Which is more costly. So that's why screening is cost effective. And we try to detect those patients at an early stage so that their survival chances are pretty good. So for Barrett's cancer, what is actually this disease? So here you see a schematic depiction of your stomach and your esophagus, and here is your diaphragm. And this is the normal situation where your stomach is nicely closed by the diaphragm, and there's a muscle here contracting. So there's no gastric acid that goes into your esophagus. But for some people, it happens that the diaphragm is too wide, and combined with some lifestyle habits and also maybe some genetic factors, it could happen that the stomach goes up a bit through this diaphragm, and then you see that it's not nicely closed anymore, and some gastric acid goes into the esophagus. And then your body actually has a very smart mechanism. It starts making other cell types that are acid resistant. So to say, to defend against tissue damage. But the downside of this mechanism is that the chance to develop cancer increases by 30 to 40 fold, right? So these patients have a really highly increased chance of developing esophageal cancer. So that's why people with a Barrett's esophagus in the Netherlands, basically they go to a community hospital to undergo endoscopy. There is an endoscopist, and he will do visual surveillance, and he will take, according to a certain biopsy protocol, we will take quite a lot of biopsies, tissue biopsies, and he will send them to pathology, and then in pathology they will check whether or not any of those biopsies contain cancer. If there's no cancer, then the patient comes back next year or in 2 years, a bit depending on how the patient looks, or how the inner inside of the patient looks. And then if one of these biopsies do contain cancer, then these patients are referred to a Barrett's expert center. So one of them is in Eindhoven, there's one in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and you have them spread over the country. So then at the Barrett's expert center, if they find the cancer and they can endoscopically remove it if it's in an early stage, and then the 5-year survival rate is also very high. It's close to 100%. So why it's not exactly 100% is that sometimes patients also suffer from other diseases, but mostly if they can remove it early, they won't die of esophageal cancer. If they detect it at a late stage, however, then radical surgery is necessary. They basically cut out part of your esophagus, and they have to combine it and make it into a stomach. It's a very heavy operation, knowing also a lot of morbidity. So if you undergo this operation, your life is not as pleasant as it used to be before. And also, a lot of people won't survive the first 5 years after the surgery. So you can see why it's important to really have early detection, but the problem is right here at the screening protocol, because this is very prone to sampling error. A lot of the tissue is not sampled. You only can pick certain amounts. Of course, you can just cut away all the tissue, and it's very difficult to recognize. So at these community hospitals, most of the patients that they will see there don't have cancer, so they have just normal looking tissue. and the exposure is pretty low. So they maybe only encounter 3 to 5 times a year a patient that has early signs of esophageal cancer. But then the learning curve is pretty steep if you only see it every once in a while. And then you don't recognize it, right? So a considerable amount of lesions is not detected at this stage here, at the early stage. So basically, they all come to the Barrett's Expert Center with advanced cancer, and then their survival chances are very low. So this is why almost 10 years ago, actually, this guy that you see over here, who's called Dr. Erik Schoon from the Catharina Hospital here in Eindhoven, came up with the idea that if I have a phone that can detect faces, this is something that became more and more popular in 2011, why can't my endoscopy equipment then not detect cancerous lesions in the same fashion, just putting a box or a boundary around a lesion if I detect one? So this was the idea. So then I'm going to start with our conventional approach. So this basically covers the period until 2016, more or less. I do want to show this because it contains some interesting elements that are still very useful, I think, right? So it's not, now it's deep learning everywhere, and it is very nice, and it works very well. But it's also nice to know the alternatives, and sometimes alternatives may be more attractive than a deep learning approach. So I will start here to take you through the whole history of what we've been doing. So the first attempts were using a conventional machine learning approach, where you extract some features from your image, then you make a decision, and you will annotate the positions where the features were associated with cancer. To do this, you have some annotated examples. I'm sure most of you will be familiar with this. You extract information also from these images, and then you basically learn to distinguish between the features that are associated to cancer and the features that are associated to healthy tissue using machine learning. And you learn this classifier over here, and you can actually make predictions. So more in particular, how did we do this? First, we used a window-based approach, also because we have only a small amount of images, so in that like 100 or something. So if you do it like this, you basically multiply the amount of data points you have, albeit smaller data points, right? You only have these windows, but you have a ton more. So if you have such a tile of such an image, you can compute something about color, something about texture. Yeah, so I'm sure most of you will know that you can, for instance, take the average of the color channels as numbers, and you can use some filters to acquire some information on the texture, because these were the two things that we found in medical literature that were described by the experts on this that were very important, the color and the texture. So how do we find these filters? So that's, I think, that was an interesting approach and still can be very interesting. So we did a Fourier analysis of the images that we had, of the files, and we found that, so basically a Fourier analysis, for the ones that don't know, what you try to do is you split your signal into different frequencies. So you have slow moving frequencies and you have very fast moving frequencies. So you can also think in an image, it goes from dark to light, for instance, or from red to blue. These are all frequencies that can happen, or transitions that can happen. And so by studying these frequencies, we found actually that there's an area where cancer showed an improved magnitude over the healthy tissue. So that there were more, in this case, waves or cycles around this, 20 hertz, so to say, than for cancer than for healthy tissue. So if you know this, you can actually design filters that cover exactly these regions. And you see this is also correlated with the 0.05 and 0.01, using this nice expression in the frequency domain. And you can make them in such a way, the formulas for the ones that like it are down below here. You can make them such exactly that these half magnitude iso lines exactly touch. So basically you see these are just half magnitude lines. So this is the exact expression, which is basically a Gaussian function in the Fourier domain. And you can put them anywhere where you like. So if you put them on certain frequency, then you have a filter here, a filter here, a filter there. And maybe this is a bit conceptual, but if I'm going to show you the associated filter kernels, they may be looking a bit more familiar, also because they will show up in your typical convolutional neural networks, but then they are just learned from the data, and here we did define them ourselves by these mathematical expressions. So you see that you have them for different orientations, and we have here 2 different scales. So the red one here is the bottom one over here. It's like the slow moving wave, and the green one over here is the top row over here. It's a bit faster moving scale. So you can actually extract now textures of different scales and different orientations, and this helped us in making a decision or training a network. How did this method look like? You see the publication was already quite old in modern machine learning pace, of course. So what did we do in the full pipeline? We had this image, you apply your filters, you also extract your region of interest, right? Because in such an endoscopic image, not every part is very useful. For instance, the black borders, you don't need to do your analysis over there. You compute your features, divide it up into windows, and then you can use, in this case, for instance, a nonlinear support vector machine to train a classifier, and then also make a distinction for new images. So this is basically how it went. Yeah, so this worked pretty well. We tested this in clinical or on a clinical data set, I have to say. Here you see the algorithm, and on the right side you see a couple of experts. So you see that also there's quite some variability in these expert ground truths. So this is what I was talking about before, right? So you see it nicely encircles the right region in the image, and there are more examples in this paper in 2016. But then we thought, is this really what we want in a clinical setting? Because basically the doctor is not going to exactly cut away this tissue, right? What was more informative for us in this peripheral medical center, doctors were taking biopsies. They were only taking small samples. So we said, okay, maybe what we should do is just make sort of a heat map for our system, and then take the most malignant regions, so the thing that is most cancerous according to our system, which would be here around this crosshair, and say that is actually where you should take a biopsy. So, and then you send this biopsy to pathology. You have an increased chance that it actually contained cancer, an increased chance that it's detected at an early stage. Then we defined 2 regions to validate this. So one would be the blue region over here, which is the expert consensus. We call this the sweet spot. So that's where more than half of the experts thought this is where actually cancer is. And the green area here, so here you see the marker, and the green area, it's not in my slides, but the green area is where at least one of the experts said there is cancer. And you can see also in the previous slide, you see it's based actually on these lines that, in this case, 6 experts draw. And then you can see that the blue areas where at least half of them agreed, and the green areas where at least one of them said there was cancer. And what we want is we want to have our marker actually in this bullseye, in this blue spot of the cancerous lesion. So here are a couple of more examples. We did an additional experiment and published it last year with this pretty old system, I have to say, but it worked pretty good on these images. But of course, these are very nicely captured images, so that's a disclaimer at this point. But you can see most of them were actually in the blue region where you want to take your biopsy, where most experts agreed that there was cancer at that particular point. So this worked pretty well, but of course, we also noticed that the trend of the convolutional neural networks that were picking up still a bit hard for us, because we didn't have too many data, as for most medical problems. But then at some point, there were some really nice papers on how you could use transfer learning to apply convolutional neural networks and deep learning to your medical problems. That's what we started to do. We developed this multitask learning network. You can recognize, maybe if you know, that this is a UNet type network, but we also included some skip connections actually to these, so ResNet-like connections in these skip layers. And this worked very well. So the idea here is that we learned classification and segmentation simultaneously. So you can see on the bottom here, there's a classifier. And here at this part here at the end of the U, there is the output segmentation. So this gives you your segmentation. And you can use this encoder for both tasks. So this is a very efficient idea, because this also regularizes training. If you have less parameters, then both problems keep each other in check, right? So if the classifier knows that there's no cancer, then the segmentation should not segment anything, right? So you know that these things, they will help each other. Basically, you have 2 sources of information. So I'm not sure how it is in abroad, but in the Netherlands we have these. If we learn kids how to ride a bike, and a lot of people ride a bike here, so then they basically get these side wheels on the sides of their bike that help them. If they go too much left, it keeps them atop, and then also if they go too much to the right, it will prevent them from falling over. And I'd like to envision this as a similar thing, right? We have two of these helping wheels that keep us going forward. And this also enables early stopping in your inference path. If you already know that there's no cancer, you don't need to go through your decoder to make a segmentation, right? So if you, for instance, want to have a real-time application, this is very helpful because at the half of your inference time, you already know whether or not to proceed, and maybe you can skip to the next frame if you know that there won't be any cancer. So that's the idea. Then we needed to train this, and then we just did a check on how do other people do this, for instance, in CT or MR and digital pathology. And you see that virtually all CAD, so computer-aided detection or computer-aided diagnosis systems, they use a convolutional neural networks that was pre-trained on ImageNet. And then you can wonder whether dogs, cats, or cars are also optimal for medical problems. And our hypothesis is that's probably not the case, right? So we collected a data set of close to 500,000 endoscopic images without any labels, but just all endoscopic images that we could find at a certain number of medical centers to pre-train a deep neural network using some basic classes. So for instance, we thought, okay, we don't have the luxury of 1,000 categories like ImageNet, but we can define a couple of classes like the stomach, the esophagus, the colon. And we can do that for part of this data set because we're not going to do that for 500,000 images. So here you can see some examples. They were pretty from all parts of the body and all types of pathologies that were actually in there. So then we had part of the data that was labeled and part of the data that was not labeled, or most of the data was actually unlabeled. So we had to devise a strategy to how to train this model, how to pre-train this model using data that was mostly unlabeled. So we did that using a semi-supervised learning approach, and actually what we did is follows. So you have some labeled data set and some unlabeled part. Then you train a basic model using your labeled data. So that's in the middle over here. And then I also like to make a comparison here that, for instance, you have your sheep in a fence here in this labeled part. And then at some point you just open the gates and the sheep will just go to different parts of this field of grass to explore what's over there, right? So basically every model here sees a different part of the data because we're going to predict pseudo labels based on this trained model for the rest of the data. And then we randomly sample new training sets. Each time we take one hand of labeled data, we take one hand of unlabeled data. And then for the unlabeled data, we took the most certain samples, right? So you can actually derive from your model what samples were basically close to the decision boundary and what samples were really confident. We took the most confident samples and added them to the training set as ground truth. And then for each model, we did that randomly. So each model saw different samples and explored different parts of the data space. We repeated this a couple of times to create a really diverse network ensemble. And in the end, we had like 125 different models. And then we did something else. We took also the best models on the validation data, like the 10% best models, to actually use as our network ensemble. Then we added something else that we thought was quite interesting. So we also applied, instead of doing a single transfer learning stage, we did a couple of them to see if that would help us. Because here you see your pre-training data, that was quite a lot. And the testing data, that was a very small set and was quite specific, right? So we thought maybe if we have some course training in between here. So in the first stage, basically the model learns to separate a stomach from an esophagus from a colon. But the final task is detecting very small textual differences in an image that are associated with cancer. So we thought if we added some stage that does course training to prepare the model for the task that it will be doing eventually. So the labels are not that nice. They're also retrospective data. There's no histology, but it can help the model basically to focus on a segmentation task. And then we did the fine-tuning on exactly the problem-specific data set that we had in mind. And we did testing on 2 different sets, the general lesions and the more subtle lesions that are often missed by medical experts. You see that on the left, there's more larger data size, and on the right, there's higher quality of the data. So basically, our philosophy is a bit that if you have terrible quality data, but it's a huge set, then it can be useful to do some pre-training. But the more you go to your target downstream task, the higher the quality of your data should be, and then also typically your data sets get smaller. These are the results of our first study where we compared to non-expert endoscopists. So why are these non-expert endoscopists? Well, they are in the peripheral centers that have to actually do this type of surveillance. You see here is the optimal point where you have a false positive rate of 0 and a true positive rate of 1. This here is where our system was, and you see that 53 gastroenterologists whom we compared to all over Europe were all underperforming with respect to the model. So this was very hopeful. Here you see some predictions that the AI model gave, also with a biopsy marker. And here you see some expert predictions, and those are the experts that are at the Barrett expert centers where we want to get those patients that are under surveillance, right? So they go to a peripheral center. They will have this checked by one of these non-experts, and then in the end they will be referred to these experts. So this was really helpful, and then it raises the question: could we also do this in a clinical setting? Because normally, when you train your medical models, you have very good data and you have nice, well-selected examples. But in the clinical practice, that's completely not the case, right? So these are still some results. So I first discussed these, and then we will continue to our clinical pilot. So another thing that we actually investigated is whether or not this GastroNet pre-training was actually performing better than ImageNet pre-training. So if you just download your model with the ImageNet weights already initialized. And we see that the best performance was this GastroNet semi-supervised model. It did slightly better actually than ImageNet, but also you have to take into account that ImageNet has 1,000 categories, and each category has approximately 1,200 examples. So the data set is much richer than that we now collected, right? So, but in our first attempt with only 5 categories and only 500,000 images, and actually only 5,000 of those were actually labeled. So we did mostly with semi-supervised. And we already show an improved performance. So if you further extend this, probably we can boost the performance even further. So then we wondered whether or not this would also work live in clinical practice. So we tested it in 2 medical centers, one in Amsterdam and one in Eindhoven. And we developed this graphical user interface to show the medical doctor where a lesion was and whether or not he should take a biopsy. So we included 20 patients just to see where we are, right? If it was completely blowing up back in our faces, or if that was actually working. So we started with 10 patients, 10 with cancer and 10 without. So they were already screened in beforehand. And the gold standard were the random biopsies and visual inspection of this Barrett's expert. So what we did, we have an image coming in, then there's this AI system that gives a prediction, there's a medical doctor that gives a prediction, and basically if both them, or if either one of them said that there was something wrong, right? So we had a red traffic light, then we take a target biopsy. If both say there's nothing wrong, then we do just the random biopsies, which is just current clinical practice. So in this setup, basically, we did not disturb the clinical workflow too much, because if, for instance, in the case that the AI system said there's something wrong, but the expert didn't see it, then we just took the biopsy of the AI system and we did the rest in the random fashion, such that we didn't really disturb the clinical protocol. So currently we use this as the expert as the gold standard, just to be sure in the first study setup. So then here you see an overview of the operating room that we were in. In the background you see the system that we did not fully start up yet. So you can see a first test screen. It's actually in the notebook. Maybe some of you can recognize that. So then if we run it, it will be full screen, and I will show a short example of that. So here you see the video. I'm not sure if everybody can see that. Let me.
Well, you should be able to run it.
Yes, I'm gonna run it. So I have to get rid of my laser pointer, and then I'm gonna run it. So basically, how it works is as follows. It's a bit slow. Okay, can you see this?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, so basically the medical doctor, this is a test setup, right? He takes an image, and then our system on a screen next to the official screen will tell whether or not there is cancer in that image and whether or not he should take a biopsy. So this is first a non-dysplastic image, so that means a patient that did not show cancer. So you see the video. At some point he takes an image, and on the right you see that the system says there's only a 4, it's not really percent, but there's a low probability that there's actually cancer in this image. So you see also there we used an ensemble, so there is some uncertainty around the prediction of the model. This is what the white box depicts. That is the model uncertainty. So if I fast forward a bit to a patient that actually showed cancer, you can see that in that case, if we take an image of the lesion, I'm not sure when it's going to show up in the screen. I think now. You can see that with a pretty high likelihood that there is cancer in this image, and it also tells you where do we have to take the biopsy. So that's actually where we then do the biopsy. And one last example is interesting because this was actually missed in the peripheral hospital, right? So you see that the AI system now detected it, but it was not detected in the peripheral center. And this is exactly why we want to do this, right?
Yeah.
So then if you look at the scores, they were pretty much in line with what we found in our offline study. So this was very exciting, actually being there in the hospital, showing really seeing that the system works where it should work. That was super exciting, and so we also recently published these results, and we're now looking into further studies. So you see that the scores are pretty high for medical standards already. And we really wanted to focus on sensitivity because we rather take one biopsy extra than that we would miss a cancer. And that's also why we should maybe switch the gold standard to the pathologist rather than to the endoscopist, because one of the samples that is in here was actually that was labeled as cancerous by our system was actually also labeled by the pathologist, by the actual ground truth as having cancer. But it was also missed by the expert, so that's something interesting. But to be fair, we just did not put it in the paper tables that way. But it is a remark I wanted to make. So, then, if do I still have some time, Terry?
Yeah, I think maybe 5 minutes. If you could wrap it up and sort of the highlights, maybe summarizing.
Yeah, okay. So let me just do the highlights. So. Then we're also working on this particular application, which I think is also very interesting because we have a new imaging modality that helps you visualize the esophageal wall in very high detail. And
wow, that's cool.
An application in which this really works for AI because it's a lot of data. It's 1,200 of those scans, and they all have approximately 8 megapixels. So if you have to scroll through all the pixels, that's just too much information for a medical doctor, and there's also a steep learning curve to actually learn this. So
awesome.
The clinical question here, thank you very much. The clinical question here is that where do we have to look in this image, because it's just too much data to process. So when you ask your average gastroenterologist to look at these images, one of them described it to me as this white noise that you would typically have on your analog TV back in the days. So I'm not sure if everybody still have actually experienced this. And now with digital television, but then you get similar image like this. You can't really recognize anything. So I'm just going to show the outcomes. So we did also that. We were better than the experts, and also I think very importantly, we were 40,000 times faster. And this is very interesting, of course, because then if you have to scroll through it, it will take up to 2 hours. Well, our algorithm can do this in 90 milliseconds.
Yeah.
Then some visual examples. So we also asked the network, so what are you looking at? And sometimes we found patterns that we really couldn't identify ourselves, right? So there is something in this data that's interesting to the network, but cannot be picked up by our eyes, because our eyes are not tuned to very, very fine pixel differences. Sometimes we could find a link with clinical indicators. So for instance, you can see that there are certain layer transitions on which the network shows an increased performance, or there were actually some irregular glands that help the network to make a better decision. And that's very cool, because then you can go back to the hospital and tell the medical doctor, so we found that maybe these layer transitions or maybe these glands can help you better detect cancer, and then they can also focus their research towards these specific structures. So then I'm going to close up. So what's ahead? What are we doing now? We're, I think, learning from large multi-center unlabeled data sets. That's really something that we want to do. So there's, if you've checked the last papers in CVPR and ICLR and these conferences, there's a lot about federated learning. I think that's becoming more and more important, because that helps you also to avoid any privacy issues. You can just send your model to the hospital, it will learn something there, you get it back, you send it to another hospital. I think that's very promising. And we need to focus on robustness of the networks and the efficiency of the networks if you really want to have it in the clinical applications. So for instance, things that we look into are weight quantization to basically reduce the networks, network pruning, decoder scaling, or wavelet-based networks that I was just telling you about, in which you already have a theoretical framework, and you don't need to learn all the kernels anymore. You only need to learn parameters that regulate these kernels. And then one last thing I think is becoming also increasingly important, especially in endoscopy, is quality control. So you want to quantify maybe some clinical parameters related to the procedure. So for instance, if every tissue, all the tissue in the esophagus or in the colon was actually visualized, because if the doctor does not visualize it, then I can have the best AI algorithm, but then it will never see it, right? So the doctor first needs to make sure that every part of that organ is visualized properly. And finally, you can also think about subjective and objective quality assessment, like is a frame ready to be analyzed, or is it maybe too blurry, or something like that. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and also on behalf of all the partners that are working with me on these great projects. So thank you very much.
Wonderful, Fons. I think the feedback that I'm getting from people is there are a few questions. Is that it's actually very great. It's original, and that was also my personal feedback. Because as much as we are excited about the use of or the application of ImageNet and all the other transfer learning models, it reaches, I always say, it reaches stardom and it reaches popularity in CAGle. It gives you some sense of achievement when you publish it, whether preprint or some other journal. But I always wonder how many of these applications ever reach or ever will reach a clinical setting inside the hospital or doctor's hands. So first of all, I think maybe there is one question I can ask. I have my own question as well, but let me just, I think there's a technical question. If you could see this question, please.
So in our group, we use all of the above, basically. But for this particular problem, we used PyTorch because it focused, it offers a bit more flexibility than TensorFlow Keras. And especially with TensorFlow 1.0, it was a bit rigid for the things that we wanted to do. And I think now with TensorFlow 2.0, you have more flexibility, also towards the flexibility that you would have in PyTorch. But yeah, so to answer your question, for this one, we were using PyTorch.
Awesome. My question is, and there are some questions I have here, but I will just summarize these for you. How did you, so I mean, 500,000 images and maybe, I don't know how many classes, did you have like 4, 5, 6 classes? Or
yeah. 5 classes in this particular case, and it was just a start to start somewhere, but we could make more classes. But the question is whether or not that will be helpful, or maybe we should fully go unsupervised.
Also, of course, self-supervised, unsupervised, those are very good steps. But in terms of computing, sort of, I'm sure you must have had required a large computing infrastructure. What did you use? Did you use some vendors, or do you have your own in-house?
No, we have in-house. So basically, all the great PhD students in our group have their own Titan RTX or their 280 Ti, in their machine, what they use for development. And then we have a large compute cluster, which also stores, where we also have a storage node with very high bandwidth channels. So we can train our models there very efficiently if we want to. But that's very recent. So most of the work that I've shown here, we just did on the local computers with state-of-the-art GPUs.
Nice. And then I see one of my own neuroscience researchers. She also is here in this chat, and I'll just post her link here. She has a question.
Would your approach with the unit would have been different if? Yeah, I think so. If you were dealing with whole slide images, that's what you're referring to, right? Yeah, I think for that, so I'm first I have to say I'm not an expert on digital pathology. I of course do know that there's a lot of work in digital pathology, and as far as I know, the scans are just much larger. So you need to be able to deal with that in a much more efficient way. So our images go up to maybe 1200 by 1600 pixels, or maybe 4K, but not much more. But if you're talking about histopathology, then you have maybe 100,000, 200,000 pixels. So that's just a whole different league. So I'm not exactly sure if our networks would be also up to that challenge. And maybe you need some more efficiency when dealing with those large scans as well.
Great. I know this because her mom, she's a doctor, and she has her own lab, actually.
Oh,
so
really?
She has yeah. So we were talking about some her own sort of university project she has to complete. Awesome. So, Sai, I hope if you can always reach out to Fons also through email.
You're very welcome.
We'll connect you. There's another question from David.
Yeah, so the latency in this particular model, like I said, we used an ensemble of models, and we didn't really exploit the hardware for this. So we just run them sequentially. And I think in the pilot that we run, we used 10 models. And we could do that under a second. So then our latency, I think, per model was maybe 100 milliseconds or something. But that included the time it took from sending it from the endoscopy tower to our external machine, and then to process it, and then to send it to the screen that we set up in the procedure room. So for the real-time applications, we're well beyond 1 second, and we're also looking at video analysis, of course, and there we are, in the order of maybe 50 milliseconds per frame or something, because you want to get that under the 30 frames per second.
Awesome. And then there's a question on GastroNet.
So yeah, basically that's an interesting question, and it took a while. I think at least a couple of days. So it's not in the order of weeks, but we had several training strategies. So for instance, if you want to do it in the way that I just described, then it takes a lot of time, because you're basically training 125 different models.
Yeah.
And then you're going to fine-tune that on data, and so each time you have to do it a lot of times. But yeah, I would say in the order of days, but yeah, I don't have the exact details to the hour. But
yeah. I know. Yeah, I mean, when your projects are stretched across 6 months or a year, then training cycles, I guess, sometimes you're probably running for weeks, sometimes you run for 6 days. But a great question, I think. It's all about, Emina, it's all about, I think, how good and how balanced your data set is. If your data set is balanced, you've done a lot of pre-processing, I guess within 2-3 days, you should be able to run with a reasonable good amount of architecture.
One thing I'd like to add, sorry for interrupting you, but that's very important, is that we did downscale the images to 256 by 256. And that helps a lot, of course. If you want to train it on full-size images, then it will take
forever.
Exponentially longer.
Yeah. Then there's another question, and then let that be the last question.
So what modifications or tuning was done to reduce the false positives and false negatives? That's an interesting question. So at the moment, we just took the, so you have to set a threshold, right? The cutoff where you say there's cancer in this image and no cancer in that image. So you could take 1/2. If you have your softmax output, you will get something between 1 and 0, and you could set it at 1/2. So the only thing we did is on the validation data, so not on the test data, but on the validation data, we found the optimal cutoff value, and I think that was 0.6. So that basically increased the threshold a little bit. So that basically reduced some of the false positives that we encountered by not reducing the sensitivity too much, right? So we found the optimal cutoff such that we had a lower number of false positives with the same amount of true positives. But so in my previous work, I actually used additional methods. So what you could also do is some binary morphological operators to, for instance, use erosion on your binary segmentation mask. That's something that we left out here because it's an additional operation and we want to make it as clean as possible. So yeah, but I think it's a very intriguing question, and it's something that we are working on also for video. And for video, you can imagine that you can also basically filter out false positives over time, because false positive is maybe a fluke in time, but if there's a consistent detection, then probably it's more likely to be a real lesion. But thanks for the question, very interesting question.
Wonderful, awesome. And as you know, when people start asking questions, then people ask more questions. So then let's make it the last Mahmoud, and then I would want to close this wonderful discussion.
So how models for ensembling differ to each other? Yeah, so you see quite a difference, right? So especially for the images that they're not sure about. So then the models become all over the place. So basically, we take random samples. If you want to have the details, it's in the MICI paper, also in the paper that is in Artificial Intelligence in Medicine, the Elsevier journal. But so there are the exact details. But basically, what you do is you take randomly from your entire data set a number of samples. You take some labeled samples, and then you use that to train your models. And if you do that for different models, you take different subsets or different bootstraps, so to say. Then you get a huge variety in your ensemble. The same thing is actually done in random forests. That's also where we got the inspiration from. One strength of the random forest is basically that you use different subsets to have a huge variety in the output of your models. Yeah, that's something that if you're into this, you should look at noisy student training. That's something that we do right now. It's more advanced than that I presented here, but it's also still in progress.
Cool, wonderful. I think the research will be ongoing. Thanks very much, Fons. I think I got to learn a little bit more about esophagus. It's not just some organ that is between my sort of orifice and my belly, but it has a vital function. What I really liked is this giving me an idea, because we are working on the dental images. So I don't know the sort of that device that was kind of scanning and taking pictures throughout the esophagus. Is that what kind of, is it a laser? What's
it's a laser. It's optical coherence tomography.
Yeah.
So for dental, I have other ideas. So maybe we should get in touch.
I think so, yeah, because we are trying something. We have a lot of data, because dental is also a 3-dimensional problem. A lot of people don't realize. Today, we just take the damn skull and we say, okay, so let's try to understand the pathology. But it's a very, very resource-intensive operation. And now with laser, there's a data set where it's emerging. But I think maybe we should have that discussion, because that's something I want to introduce into the World Health Organization as well, this idea.
Yeah, so I would be very welcome to further explore. I see another question on the semi-supervised models, whether or not it's more accurate than supervised ones. I think this is also a very interesting question, and it's an emerging research topic that you want to get rid of all the labels. So if you look at these very modern approaches, they have models that compete with supervised ImageNet performance while doing self-supervised learning. So for instance, we're using contrastive predictive coding or such techniques, but the problem is that you need a really substantive amount of data to actually be able to do that. But this is really also an interesting question, and it's a very active research area, I think.
Absolutely. I think self-supervised learning, especially also the New York Medical Hospital, where Facebook researchers and also one of the Facebook's chief scientist works, they're also experimenting a lot of self-supervised learning, because it's one of the sort of inventions of also, or let's say proposals of Jan LeCun.
Yeah, definitely.
So, yeah. So awesome. I mean, this is so great. I mean, I get super excited when I have these conversations. I thank you so much, Fons. I want to sort of just say to the rest of the people, this question looks very stupid, but I want to answer this question because Jacob, as much as Fons realizes working in the, at the university, at the medical hospital, the world needs more people to enter into the field of healthcare. And fortunately and thankfully, someone like me, as an example, was pretty bad in biology in high school. I learned these things, especially histopathology, pathology, cytology, and all these other fields, because I got so excited using technology. I would suggest, not just to you, Jacob, but to the rest of the people, is, there are lots of openings out there in the industry where healthcare industry will expand as more and more use of machine learning and deep learning will penetrate into these areas. So if you're looking for career changes, definitely talk to local hospitals, talk to researchers in your neighborhood. I think I don't think there is a hindrance for anyone in this industry in the Netherlands today as well. I mean, if you look at because of Corona, there are very talented people who've been working in transportation industry that probably is not going to recover until the next 3-4 years. I think people should, not everybody is going to become a researcher, but there are many areas where your expertise will be needed to help sort of promote artificial intelligence. There are a few questions. I will make sure that I save these.
I think it's an interesting question, and I see this also a lot, right? So it's becoming a more active area. I think you have to really find the place where you want to be active, right? So there's a whole spectrum of AI research, some a bit more applied, some a bit more theoretical. So if you, for instance, look at CADe, this is this platform for more applied problems. I think you can easily learn to code, and you can easily learn PyTorch. You can easily learn to make a model that does handwritten digit classification without understanding too much of the mathematics behind it. If you're interested in really diving deep and maybe improving those models at a more fundamental level, then I would really advise you to dive into the mathematics and the processing that's behind it. But if you just want to make the application, you actually can do that very easily with the tools that are
exactly. Exactly. Awesome. Fons, thank you very much. Thank you for this wonderful sort of, closing a beautiful, let's say, despite the circumstances we are all in. I wish you a great weekend. We'll definitely get in touch. I'll try to loop in more questions and send it over to you through email. And thanks once again. Take care, Fons.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your attention and the interesting questions. It was a pleasure.
It was mine as well. Thank you. Thank you. I'm shutting the broadcast.
Bye-bye.